Government representative take a question?
With pleasure.
Thank you, Senator Gold. Thank you very much for your very clear speech kicking off this serious and historic debate. And thank you to my colleagues from all sides in this chamber for your important questions. While I was disappointed we were prevented by some from having a well-moderated committee of the whole with the ministers associated with the Emergencies Act as part of today's sitting, I found the briefing last evening and questions asked by my colleagues to be very helpful as we individually and collectively work to understand the situation leading to the Emergencies Act being proclaimed and the implications of that. The following is the question I had wanted to ask the ministers last night. You have said the government was reluctant to invoke the Emergencies Act and it plans to end it as soon as possible. You mentioned the government are in regular, sometimes hourly communication with law enforcement and other sources of intelligence about the situation of continued risks and threats. Now, I would like to look at a future scenario. Let's say, based on satisfying the reasonable grounds that have been discussed, the Emergencies Act is revoked sometime between now and the 30-day mark. We know there's a highly sophisticated, well-connected, well-resourced organization endowed with highly effective communications capabilities behind the recent occupations and blockades. That is not in question. But it worries me. What if they were to regroup quickly after the revocation of the Act and act again in illegal ways to cause further serious harms of a similar or worse nature and or magnitude to the ones caused recently? Are there new non-Emergency Act measures and tools being developed now, or is there a plan to quickly develop those by the government and its counterparts to fill the gaps that caused us to have to use the Emergencies Act now for this first time? Or would we be in a position of having to proclaim the Emergencies Act as the only response again? Thank you.
Senator Gold.
Well, thank you. That's an important question. You're not the only one preoccupied with the possibility that the calm that we now see may be the calm before other events, whether here in the city, as some have expressed an intention to return, or at our border crossings, as some have expressed as well. I would say four things. First, well, maybe three things. First is, I hope, and there's evidence that, in fact, provinces and police forces across the country have learned some lessons from what was allowed to happen here in Ottawa. And that's why, though there is concern about protests in other cities, and my goodness, Winnipeg has been occupied to some considerable degree. It's been off the radar, the national radar, but it's been going on for some time. But that's why, for example, the initial truck convoys to Quebec City were managed better than the convoys when they arrived here. So there's some lessons learned that have already been learned and will be properly studied and evaluated in the context of the inquiry that's contemplated at the end. But I would say two more things. First of all, as I mentioned in my speech, the federal government is already considering and planning to introduce standalone legislation to expand the scope of FinTrack so that it covers the platforms and the fundraising platforms. I mean, the world has changed so dramatically, and social media has had such a dramatic impact, and not simply on how it shapes people's attitudes and inclines them and mobilizes them, but just in terms of how money gets moved around. Add to that cryptocurrency, which we've seen very much at play here. So the government is taking steps. One of the lessons it's learned is that we need something more durable and enduring that doesn't require the invocation of these measures. Secondly, and the details escape me, but I know that there are measures being considered in the province of Ontario to specify and greater powers or the use of existing powers in a more targeted way so that they were the situation to arrives would be able to do their part to resist the returns of blockades and the like. At the end of the day, one hopes that the lessons learned, ordinary measures that all legislatures and parliaments should be thinking about, will be sufficient. I should add one last, but if not, then the Act remains there in those extraordinary last resort circumstances. But the other point that I should have made earlier, and excuse me for the order of my answer, is that even when, and we all hope it's sooner rather than later, the Emergency Act is revoked, the investigations and the prosecutions which are underway will continue. Just because the Act will cease to be in force at some time soon, one hopes, doesn't mean that the illegal acts that were taken while they were illegal are forgiven. So one also hopes that the measures taken, and sometimes it's under the criminal code. I mean, it's not simply the Emergency Act supplements existing jurisdictional frameworks. So the charges that have been laid, the measures taken to deal with the financial, the freezing of bank accounts, and so on, one hopes will also provide some disincentive for those inclined to want to continue the project of occupying, blockading, and destabilizing our country.
Supplementary.